me just a second. I'm still finishing my talk right now. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to speak with y'all tonight. I can't see any of y'all, but hopefully you can see what's on the screen. So I'm going to talk about pheromones, the language of the colony. If I can figure this out. There we go. So honeybees talk to each other in a lot of different ways. They signal each other through dancing. We're all familiar with the waggle dances. And they also have a stop signal. They can actually tell each other to stop dancing. So if a forager is out and encounters danger, so there's a predator like a spider at a patch of flowers, she can fly home and she can tell the dancing bees to stop. Quit sending people there, that's a bad neighborhood. There's also a system of vibroacoustics. So honeybees can detect a lot of different vibrations in the hive. And they can even detect sounds at low frequencies. I'm sorry, there's a really bad echo. All I can hear is myself about 15 times. Is there a way to turn that off?
Yep.
Okay, that's better. So honeybees detect vibrations within the hive. There's all kinds of things going on. If you knock around a hive before you open it, you probably notice that they might be a little bit more upset sometimes. But there's a lot of ways that bees interpret those vibrations. They can detect low frequency sounds as well using their antenna. They have an organ called a Johnston's organ in the little elbow part of their antenna, the part that bends. And there's actually a lot of research going on right now for building devices that can listen in on the hive to the frequencies of the buzzings and other sounds so that we can try to interpret what's going on in there. And then maybe someday you'll get an alert on your phone like this that says your favorite hive just swarmed, so too bad. Hopefully we can find a way to interpret those signals ahead of time, you know, so that you might have a day or two to prepare for that, but we're not quite to that point yet. But what we do know a lot about is chemical signals in the hive. There's a lot of different pheromone signals that the bees use as a language. And I like this picture here because all the bees are going one direction, except for that one bee right there. I always wonder what's going on with her. Why did she not get the message? Why is she going back in when everybody else is going out? So somebody didn't get the memo there. But a beehive is a very noisy place as far as information goes. There's a lot of vibrations going on, but there's also a lot of odors. And honeybees live in a world full of odors. And those chemical odors, those pheromones, are the prime language that they use. You think of a colony as a superorganism that's got to know how to regulate itself. Everything that's going on in there, all the activities, they need to stay efficient. And so that requires a lot of communication. The bees have all kinds of systems to keep tabs on what's going on, the state of the colony and what they need the most. Lots of signals and feedback loops that are constantly relaying this information back and forth to every member in the colony. Pheromones are a really ideal way for bees to communicate. It's pretty advanced, it's elaborate, and it's very effective for a beehive environment. Pheromones can be used to communicate information in a lot of different ways. You can use it to convey a message from one individual to the entire colony, such as from a brood, from a larva to a nurse bee, or from the queen to the rest of the bees. These pheromones can go a very short distance, or they can go a very long distance throughout the colony. They can also be relayed over a very brief time, or they can have a much longer duration and have long-lasting effects on the hive as well. But it helps to organize and continuously regulate everything going on in the hive, all the jobs that are being done and the activities, as well as the structure of the hierarchy, you know, basically with the brood that wants to be capped, and they can navigate toward them. Also, bees recognize mite-infested pupae, so our hygienic bees can recognize a signal that's coming from the mites. There's some evidence that small hive beetles also react to a variety of hive odors, whether those are specifically pheromones or it's the odors of other cues in the hive, the beeswax, the honey, and other beetles and things like that. There's also a group called allomones that are similar chemical signals. They elicit an effect on another individual that's favorable to the creature that produced it, but not necessarily the creature that is receiving it. An example of that would be laying workers. They can produce kind of a quasi-queen pheromone, so they can pass as a queen, and other bees may treat them somewhat like a queen, but they're not one. The same with the Cape honeybees. They can change their odor from worker to queen-like, but in both of these cases, it's not necessarily good for the colony. They're going to dwindle and begin to die out if that situation isn't rightened. So pheromones are involved in just about every aspect of the colony's daily life and all of their activities. And all of the bees that are doing all of these jobs every day, constantly feeding information back into the system to help regulate who's doing what and to maintain everything in an optimal state. And you know more or less what an optimal beehive looks like. It's got a lot of happy bees. They have a gentle disposition. They're making lots of brood. They're storing up lots of honey. But hives don't stay stagnant. They're either growing or they're declining pretty much all the time. And so sometimes we don't recognize if they're on the wrong track and we lose colonies. We can look at that after the fact, hindsight, and think, oh, I should have done this, or maybe I shouldn't have done that. But the bees are constantly working to keep everything in just the right state. All the colony members are involved in all of these interactions, and they're all interacting with each other in different ways. So if you've got two queens in the same hive, we know that they don't necessarily get along. Queens and workers interact in certain ways. Queens and drones. Workers interact with other workers. Workers with drones, and even the brood interacts with the adult bees in the hive. So that's all going on constantly. Scientists classify the pheromones into two basic groups. We call them primers and releasers. It's kind of technical, but you don't necessarily need to know it, but it's good to kind of understand what some of it is. So the primers act on the bees on a physiological level. They trigger these long-term complex reactions and behaviors, and they cause developmental changes in gland development and things like that, and long-term changes in behavior. Mostly this is the queen pheromones and the brood pheromones fall into this category. The other one is the releasers. These generally have weaker effects on the bees. They are induced very quickly, but they only trigger short-term behavioral responses, things like alarm pheromone or nasanov scent, things like that. And this is mostly the worker pheromones, but some of the queen pheromones do the same thing. So we talk about queen pheromones a lot, and so we'll just kind of start right there. It's one that most of us have heard of. Maybe you've given some thought to it, even if you haven't really delved into understanding all the different aspects of it. But the queen pheromones are the main regulatory factor going on in a bee colony. It affects every single bee in multiple ways every day. So the queen produces a lot of different pheromones. She's got different glands and different body parts, and they're all producing different chemicals. And so it makes kind of a cocktail of different stuff. There is no one single queen pheromone. It's a blend, and it's unique. It's proprietary to every single queen. And that's what makes her smell, her odor, different from all the other queens and all the other colonies in your apiary. They might smell the same to us, but the bees know the difference. We call them queen scent or queen signal or queen odor or queen substance, but it's all a blend of queen pheromones. And the bees are constantly evaluating the performance of their queen. That's based on the level of pheromones that she's putting out. And some of the components are really important. Some of them are kind of minor, but they still play into it as well. But if your workers judge that that queen is poor quality because she's not producing enough pheromone, she is injured or she's aging or something like that, then that that makes the bees want to supersede her, replace her with another one, and hopefully they'll have better luck. In the absence of a queen, of course, the workers have to quickly rear another queen. They've got to work with the brood they've got, because in a few days, all the larvae will be too old. They won't be able to produce a queen at all, and that colony may become hopeless. After about 2 weeks of no queen, then you get a lot more laying workers develop. We probably always have 1 or 2 laying workers at least, but generally they don't have a big impact. But after a couple of weeks with no queen pheromone, then you have a lot of bees that have developed in this environment with no queen pheromone. Their ovaries begin to develop, and they really start to take on that pseudo-queen role. If you've got an old queen who's failing, you've got reduced queen substance. And of course, if she's dead, then there's that absence. But within just hours of the queen disappearing, bees detect that, and they know something's going on, and they know how to act pretty quickly to do that. When the queen and the brood are both gone, that's when the laying workers become really common. You can get away with being queenless for a little while as long as you've got a lot of open brood that are giving off pheromones as well. That also helps to inhibit the worker reproduction. But when we have a lot of laying workers, this results in a lot of drones. The workers are dying of old age, and so the colony just becomes really disorganized. It's dirty. There's all the food stores get depleted. Bees stop bringing more resources in, and the whole thing becomes more susceptible to pests, robbers, predators, pathogens. Basically, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. So the queen's pheromones are what make her so attractive to the other bees. They make her attractive to the workers. They form that retinue around her that we're familiar with. Sometimes people call it the queen's court or her attendants. They feed her, they groom her, they lick her clean, they carry away her waste, they give her pep talks. You're doing great, Mom. They cheer her on. They pat her on the back with their antennae all day. Sometimes I look at that queen and I think, I bet she could really just use a moment of peace once in a while, but they all seem pretty happy. So I guess we'll let them do what they're doing. Her pheromones also make her attractive to drones. Not in the hive, but unmated queens are attractive to drones when they're out flying around within drone congregation areas. Back in the hive, drones don't seem to have much of an interest in them. Maybe they recognize that that's their own sister. That's a no-no. I'm not sure, but queen's pheromones also keep a swarm cohesive. There's other pheromones going on in there, particularly the nasanov. But if a swarm leaves the hive without its queen, they go off, they fly around, they'll come back, they may even settle in cluster, but then they'll often return to the hive. So they need that queen pheromone there in order to maintain that swarm. This is how we can make a bee beard, that queen pheromone. Usually people will take a queen, put her in a cage, and you'll strap it under your chin, and you dump out a bunch of bees, and they're attracted to that. Of course, some people hide queen cages elsewhere. I'm not sure where Landy keeps hers, but maybe it's just her personality that the bees love to go to Landy. But they're attracted to that queen scent, and because they're outside of the hive, they've got no brood, they've got no food to defend. They're usually in a pretty gentle mood and less likely to sting. Doesn't mean they won't, but they're usually less likely to if we don't make any sudden moves. One of the main pheromones of the queen that we know about, we talk about, is the QMP, the queen mandibular pheromone. And it's a very complex substance that's got at least 18 components that we know about. And 5 of them are probably the most important, although the others definitely play a role. And they've got a bunch of long chemical names, but we won't go into all that. If you're a chemistry major, I'll send those to you if you want to read up on them. But all of these other compounds are produced in different parts of the queen's body, and by themselves, they're not necessarily very active on inducing reactions from the other bees or behaviors. But when they're present with the mandibular pheromone, then it makes all of the action of the pheromones much stronger in a lot of cases. The composition of the queen's pheromones does change over time. So it elicits different responses from other bees over different times as the queen ages. Newly emerged queens, queens that are in the process of mating, and after they've mated and they've started laying eggs, these same chemical components will change in their ratios, and they'll change the way other bees react to those queens. There's a lot of different glands on queens and workers and drones too, but there's a large gland just above the mandibles called a mandibular gland. And this is where the mandibular pheromone is produced. There's a duct that opens up and a groove that this pheromone runs right down and into the mandibles, so that when worker bees are attending to the queen, they're feeding her that royal jelly that is part of her diet. They're actually picking up a lot of the queen's pheromones themselves. And the worker bees are constantly sharing food with each other. So they are sharing by trophallaxis, just food mouth to mouth. And so the attendant bees that share food with other workers are passing that pheromone on and on and on to other bees in the hive. And the queen actually receives a lot of her own pheromone back to her from the workers when they're feeding her, and probably also some of the pheromone that she produces in her own mandibles, she's probably also swallowing as well. But that's an important component of her diet, and it helps to regulate some of the behaviors in the colony as well. A lot of functions related to queen rearing are related to this QMP. When there's a lot of it in the hive environment, then it inhibits swarming and supersedure. So younger queens produce a lot more of this pheromone. Older queens produce a little less as they age, and so that's why you hear people say that younger queens swarm less and older queens tend to swarm a little bit more. But when there's a very low level, either an old queen or an injured queen who's not producing that, then the workers, remember, the workers interpret that as a poor quality queen, and so they start that process of supersedures. They'll find brood that is the right age, and they will start to create those queen cells, or they'll draw out the brood cells into queen cells, and they'll start that process on their own. So when the colony is large, then the individual workers and the queen herself start to receive less and less of this pheromone on a per capita basis. So you guys are eating pizza tonight, I believe. You can slice that pizza into 10 or 12 slices and everybody gets one, but you have more and more people come to the party. You got to start slicing those pizzas into smaller and smaller and smaller slices until pretty soon everybody's getting such a tiny amount that they're still hungry. So in a colony that's got a really productive queen, she's very prolific, she's laying a lot of eggs, then you've got a huge population of workers. The amount of pheromone that she can produce is still finite, and when it's divided up by more and more workers, each one gets less and less, and the queen herself gets less. So when she's not being fed enough back in her own diet, that's what induces the queen to go and find a queen cup on the edge of a comb, one of those shallow vertical cells, and she puts an egg in that. And if a worker bee encounters an egg in a vertical cell, then she'll begin to provision that with more royal jelly, and the bees will draw those cells down and create those recognizable queen cells that we're familiar with. So this pheromone inhibits workers from starting queen rearing when there's a lot of it, but not from giving care to developing larvae. And that's what allows us to take larvae, graft them into cells, and we can put 50 cells into a strong colony, and they'll rear them all out, or they'll try to rear them all out without even thinking about it. As long as we have the queen excluder in place, or there's no queen in there, those bees will go at it. So that allows us to do that. And of course, also the orientation of those cells in the downward vertical position also helps to trigger that in the worker bees. A lot of this pheromone suppresses worker reproduction. We're probably familiar with what multiple eggs in a cell means. That's usually a sign of laying workers. Sometimes it's a really young queen who hasn't quite got the hang of laying eggs yet. She'll drop multiple ones in cells, but usually that's laying workers. Workers do have ovaries, but as long as there's queen pheromones in the environment, then their ovaries really don't develop very well. Normally they don't lay eggs. There's always a couple of laying workers in a hive that are trying to get along with it, but usually there's not very many. And a lot of times the other workers will actually police that and sometimes remove those eggs. But in the absence of that queen pheromone, then ovaries can sometimes become active. The workers have fewer ovarioles, so they produce fewer eggs. And of course, they can't mate, so they only produce unfertilized eggs, and so they produce only drones. Now, we don't like this. This makes the whole colony unproductive. But if you look at it from the bees' perspective, if they've gone hopelessly queenless, then producing a whole lot of drones is really their last-ditch effort of this colony to get their family genetics out there into the world. They produce thousands of drones, and hopefully one of those drones might make it to find a virgin queen before it's too late and kind of carry on the family line in another colony somewhere else. It's likely that the queen pheromones work with other pheromones, such as brood. The brood has its own pheromones that all work together to suppress worker reproduction, but the queen mandibular pheromone is one of the main ones that does that. And it's just one of the components of what we call queen scent. There's a lot of other substances being produced in different parts of the queen's body that play into that as well. Workers, whoops, didn't do that slide very well, did I? Well, the workers will lick and antennate the queen's abdomens. If you watch them when they're gathered around, when you've got a frame with the queen there, you know, they gather around her as soon as she stops laying eggs, and they tap her body with their antenna, and they gather around, they feed her. This is associated mostly with mated queens. They don't do this to unmated queens. So virgin queens, they'll feed them, but they kind of wait for them to go out and mate and come back. Only about 10% of the bees are what we call lickers. They're actually licking the tergal glands, the tergal gland secretions from the abdomen of the queen. But this minority picks up about 50% of her pheromones. They swallow a lot of what they receive, and the rest they pass on. But that's probably important in the production of the brood food that they get, and they're feeding some of that back to the queen as well. Of course, the queen and the workers both have tarsal glands. As the queen walks around on the comb, she's depositing this kind of oily substance as she goes, and it's got a pheromone associated with it, a volatile pheromone that the other bees can smell. They can keep track of where she's been, and it actually inhibits queen cell construction in the areas where she's been walking around a lot. So it works with the QMP, as I said, but it doesn't really do anything by itself. As long as there's still some QMP, then that's what it really needs. But as the queen ages, this is another one of those pheromones that diminishes. There's another one called a Dufour's gland that is associated with egg pheromones or egg marking and reproduction. It likely helps the workers to recognize that an egg has been produced by the queen and not by a laying worker. And sometimes workers will remove eggs that have been produced by laying workers. It's called worker policing. And they may kill them as eggs. They may actually eat them sometimes too. And the queen sometimes will do the same thing. As she's walking around looking for cells to lay eggs in, if she detects one that she doesn't recognize as her own, she may actually eat that, conserve the protein, and let them clean it out, and she'll lay her own egg in there instead. This pheromone, it helps to attract the retinue to the queen only on mated queens, so it starts being produced after the queens are mated. It has a similar effect in laying workers. They produce a little bit of this pheromone as well, not as strongly, but it attracts other bees to laying workers, and it helps them to interact and get along as kind of a queen, and maybe it helps them to be fed by some of their sisters as well. But this pheromone from this gland, it tells the colony that it's queen right and that the queen is there and that she's healthy, despite the fact that I misspelled the word healthy there. So again, this works with the QMP, and it helps to prevent worker ovary development. Another pheromone that queens produce is queen fecal pheromone, which sounds pretty awful, and I imagine that it probably is. This is produced only by virgin queens, and it's unique to them, and it's contained in the feces. When they're about 24 hours old, they begin to produce this, and it lasts for a couple of weeks, just the time when young queens may have some hostile encounters with other queens or with some of their sisters. They're trying to establish themselves as the one and only queen. So if they're being harassed by other bees, other workers, then they actually will discharge their feces at the workers or at rival queens, and it repels them, as you would imagine it would, and induces an auto-grooming behavior in those other bees, as you would imagine it would. And it also reduces aggression. So the other bees will kind of keep back if the queen squirts poop at them, which I guess I could understand. And of course, this is released when rival queens are fighting each other as well. So it can really hit the fan, I suppose. Another gland that is associated with the queen, and it's also found in workers, is the Koschevnikov gland. I almost mispronounced that. I always say Kalashnikov, but I know that's not right. So this is found both in queens and workers, and it produces pheromones that are very caste specific. So even though the gland is found in both types of female bees, the products of those glands are completely different. In queens, it's just another part of the overall queen scent, and the gland itself starts to degenerate after the queen is about a year old. And this contributes to the loss of all of her signals, and it helps to perhaps register that a queen is starting to age. In workers, it produces the alarm pheromone, isopentyl acetate, that we're familiar with. This is the one that smells a little bit like bananas. So completely different in the workers and the queens. And this, of course, is released when the bees sting. So workers and queens have a lot of the same glands. It makes sense because there's no real genetic difference between workers and queens, but they do develop differently based on the diet they have as a larva and which genes get turned off and on. But for the most part, they have most of the same parts, but they do differ in the amount of pheromones that they produce. Alarm pheromone is a very important one to us beekeepers, and it's one that people probably learned about a long time ago, whether we understood it or not. But we know that alarm spreads very quickly from bee to bee throughout the whole hive if they get upset. When a bee feels threatened, when a bee feels like she needs to defend herself or her colony, she gives off this molecule, and it quickly excites all the other bees. It brings them to the entrance of the hive and into the air around it, lets them know that there's danger. This is a very tiny, lightweight molecule. It's very volatile, so once the bees give it off, it floats around very rapidly in the environment around the hive and inside the hive. And of course, if you've got a lot of hives together and you upset one, then those hives that are downwind sometimes will get a little bit upset as well. So this is used to tag intruders as a specific threat. So that includes you and me and bears and things like that, large animals that come to a hive that the bees try to sting. So if you get stung on the hand, you know, your hand is tagged as a danger. Of course, you want to get the stinger out right away. You grab your hive tool and you scrape that out, but grab your smoker and puff some smoke across your hand on that spot, because you want to cover up that odor that the bees have left there. If you've got an old pair of bee gloves, leather gloves that you've been using for years and years, you've been stung on the hands and knuckles numerous times, you've got a lot of alarm pheromone that's actually embedded in those gloves. So your bees may actually react when you put your hands into the hive. Isopentyl acetate is one of the main components of that, and that's the one that smells like bananas. So it's released when the bees sting, and another alarm pheromone is found in the bee's mandibles. It's called 2-heptanone, and it's a mandibular alarm pheromone. It serves the same function with the bees, alerting other bees as danger, but this one is released when the bees bite, and it helps to identify an individual bee as a robber or an intruder. So when robber bees come to the entrance, the guard bees will push them away. If they bite them, then they're tagged with this pheromone that lets other bees come to the aid, and they can recognize, even though all the bees may look very similar, this puts a specific smell on the intruder that the other bees can react to. They can help to drive it away. This one also, it anesthetizes and paralyzes varroa mites when they're bitten. So one of the things that bee breeders are trying to produce right now is bees that will automatically groom mites off of themselves and off of other bees. The folks over at Purdue University are trying to breed what they call the ankle biter trait in bees. It makes them aggressive towards the varroa mites. And when mites are bitten, this pheromone, for some reason, it helps to paralyze them. So they just drop to the bottom of the hive or the landing board, and they can't seem to move. So that's interesting in itself. Of course, smoke has been used by beekeepers for centuries, and maybe we didn't understand why for a long time. You've probably all heard somebody say that, oh, the bees think it's a forest fire, and so they fill up on honey and can't sting. And while that is probably, there's some truth to that, and if you oversmoke bees, they will tear open combs and gorge themselves on honey. But if they're doing that, you're probably using too much smoke. So a little dab will do you in most circumstances. Of course, with Africanized bees, they will react to alarm pheromone much quicker in much larger numbers, and they will stay upset much longer. And so that's why in South America, they have really large smokers compared to the ones that we typically use. And very often they'll have somebody whose whole job is just to operate the smoker the entire time they're going through those hives. So smoke interferes with the ability of the bees to detect alarm pheromone using their antennae. You know, if you go camping, you sit around a campfire, then it gets in your clothes and your hair, and by the end of your camping trip, everything smells like smoke. So it covers up the odor receptors on the bees when we puff smoke in there, and it makes them unable to smell alarm pheromone, among other things. It interferes with that pheromone communication, and one bee can't tell that another bee is upset or necessarily why, and so it helps to keep all of the bees a little bit calmer. Another pheromone that we are probably familiar with is the nasanov scent. And bees have the nasanov gland under the 7th segment on the abdomen. It's discharged into a groove between the 6th and 7th. But you'll often see bees on the landing board. They're in this downward position like they're doing yoga or something. And they've got their tail end in the air, and they're flapping their wings vigorously, even though they're not flying anywhere. They're exposing this little white stripe across the end of the abdomen. If you open up a hive and you shake a lot of bees out, or maybe you're installing a package bees or something like that, or you hive a swarm, once you've closed the hive up, you often notice a lot of bees doing this fanning. And this is creating a plume of pheromone, goes out into the air, and it attracts it and calls to a lot of lost bees, bees that are not sure what just happened or where to go. These bees are flying around in random patterns, and as soon as they smell this nasanov scent, then they can follow it to its source, which is this bee who is standing at the entrance of the hive. And once she's there, she can find her way in. But this helps to get a lot of lost, confused bees out of the air. If you're installing a lot of different packages sometimes, you've got shaking a lot of bees out in the air, there may be a lot of this nasanov scent going around, and you may find that a lot of bees are drifting to the one colony that has got the most bees fanning the entrance, or it may be the one colony that is furthest upwind. So all of the lost bees are following that scent to its source, and they're going as far as they have to. Nurse bees don't produce very much nasanov. It's something that they start to produce when they get to about the guarding age and the foraging age. There's some evidence that varroa mites are attracted toward bees with a higher nasanov production, usually older foragers. So there's some research going on to see if there's a way that we could somehow use this to find if mites can find a way to confuse the mites and attract them away from the brood nest. But I don't know if that's really getting anywhere. It's probably a reaction on the mites' parts to be attracted to this nasanov so that they can disperse from the hive. They can get on older foragers, get out in the world, and maybe get to another bee colony somewhere else. There's a lot of different components in nasanov pheromone. Among them are geranic acid and geraniol, which is one of the major components. And these are what we smell when we think of lemongrass oil. And there's some other things in there as well. But if you ever purchase a citronella candle to sit on your back patio with at night when the mosquitoes come out, that actually has some of the same components. So people will buy these candles that are trying to repel mosquitoes, which don't work very well anyway, at least not here in the South. They repel mosquitoes, but they may accidentally start to attract bees if it's got the right blend in there. Just another example of different chemicals having different reactions on different insects. But this pheromone also helps a swarm to stay cohesive. So when that swarm is at rest, all the bees stay together in the cluster. They're producing a lot of that nasanov pheromone. A lot of this artificial nasanov is used in swarm lures to try to lure that swarm into a bait hive. And also when the bees are in flight, when that swarm picks up and moves, there's a relatively small number of scout bees that are producing a huge amount of nasanov, and they zip through that cloud of bees to the front, and then they kind of hang back along the edges as the rest of the bees move forward. And once they get to the back of the cloud, they zip through again. It's the small number of bees that actually have been to the new home, the new tree, or wherever they're moving to, and they're leading all the other bees in that huge cloud that's the size of a school bus all the way a mile, 2 miles away through the forest to that one little knothole high up in a tree. And they use this nasanov pheromone to do that. Nasanov is also used to recruit foragers to water sources that may not have a distinctive odor on their own. Often when bees find water, they will return to the same spot along a creek or to a bird bath or to something else as often as they can. And so they may use this scent to mark that area to help other bees to be able to find that water, especially in areas that might be drier and not necessarily have access to a lot of water. Sometimes they may find food sources that don't have a characteristic scent, so like the way flowers do, and they may use this scent as well to help other bees to find that. When a virgin queen is about to leave on a mating flight, sometimes a lot of worker bees will assemble at the entrance of the hive, and they'll produce a lot of this nasanov scent as well. And it's thought that that's to help the queen go off for a little while and help to find her way back to the hive. So in addition to visual landmarks, it's just an odor landmark that she can help to follow her back. Just like the queen, your workers have tarsal glands, but they work a little bit differently with the worker bees. As the bees come and go at the entrance of the colony all day, every day, a lot of this footprint pheromone begins to build up. So if you think about bees in the wild, in a hollow tree, there's a little knothole the size of a nickel, 30 feet up, in the middle of a forest where all the trees basically look identical to the untrained eye. How do bees find their way through that? And how do they find that one little entrance? Of course, they've got a lot of visual landmarks that they've memorized, but this footprint pheromone builds up around the entrance of the hive and kind of creates a bullseye as they are approaching. It helps them to zero in on that one little spot. So over time, that really does build up. And there's some evidence that bees may mark flowers that they have visited. So if you watch bees work in a patch of clover or some other flowers that have a lot of little florets on them, they'll go to some and not others. We know that flowers also have electrostatic charges, and bees build up an electric charge as their wings flap, and as they land on a flower, it may change the charge temporarily. So there's a lot going on with the flowers we don't necessarily understand, but they may also be able to detect that a bee has been on that flower within the last short amount of time, and so they might skip that flower because it smells like another bee's footprint. There's another pheromone that we just call forager pheromone, and it's not completely understood, but it's released by older foragers, and it helps to slow down the maturing rate of nurse bees. So when there's a lot of this pheromone around, then the nurse bees will stay as nurses a little bit longer. So it helps to regulate the age structure of the colony and the jobs that are being done in the colony. And it helps to maintain just that optimal ratio of nurses to foragers. So in the absence of older bees, if something happens to them for some reason, they visit a pesticide and they all get killed, or sometimes we make a split and we take half the bees away and we mess up that age structure. If the older bees disappear from the hive, then younger bees begin foraging at an age earlier than they normally would. We call it precocious foraging. Oftentimes they're not quite as efficient at it, but they grow into the role, and everything gets back into balance after a little while. But this is just another pheromone that the worker bees do produce. Drones also produce some pheromones. We haven't really studied a lot about the drones, but we know that they produce mandibular pheromone, and it likely attracts other drones to a suitable drone congregation area. So within the bounds of that drone congregation area, they have very specific boundaries, and the bees fly around and within a very tight area. We're not completely sure exactly what makes it up, but they are probably attracted to each other, and it also helps virgin queens be attracted to those same areas as well. And of course, the brood also produces a number of pheromones, and these pheromones change as the larva gets a little bit older, and it's a combination of a lot of different chemical substances that are in different ratios. But the worker bees, the nurse bees, can tell the age and the caste of each individual larva. So they walk up to a cell, they stick their antennae down into the cell, and they can tell whether that's a worker, a drone, or supposed to be a queen, how old it is, what its nutritional needs are, if it's hungry, if it needs its diaper changed, what all they need to know about those larvae. They can tell just by dipping their antennae in there and taking up those brood pheromones. Of course, veromites also pick up on some of those same pheromones, so those pheromones when the mites are detecting it. Those mites that you see on that bee also detect the cuticular volatile. So the cuticle, the exoskeleton of the bee, is giving off molecules that tell that mite how old she is, which is associated with what her role is in the hive. And those mites will actually change hosts multiple times before they finally get onto the bee they want. They want a young nurse bee that is tending the oldest larvae, because the oldest larvae are the ones that are just about to be capped off. And so that mite may be riding around on this nurse bee, waiting until she gets close enough to a cell where this larva is giving off an odor that says, "Oh man, I am stuffed. I couldn't eat another bite of bee bread. Go ahead and put a lid on it, cap my cell." And that mite will scramble down into the bottom and hide in that brood food and wait for the cell to be capped off. And of course, as I mentioned before, some of our bees are able to detect that underneath this cell, there's a mite that is reproducing. They've got special odor receptors in their antenna, and so our hygienic bees will chew that cell open and drag that poor little pupa out kicking and screaming, chew it up and get rid of it, but interrupt the mite reproduction and help to suppress the number of mites in the colony. So there's all kinds of stuff going on inside the hive at the same time. There's a whole language going on. It's a noisy place, but the bees seem to understand it, and all of this helps to balance everything that's going on in there. And so that's basically pheromones in a nutshell. If there's anybody still listening, I'd be happy to try to answer a question.
John, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Cool. I'm going to hand around the microphone and people can ask questions.
Great.
One question. Yeah.
Yeah, I need to read my notes.
That sounds like Landy.
Yeah, it is. I know I had a couple of questions.
All I hear is music. I'll just make one up on the spot. That's what you usually do when I need an answer.
Wait a minute.
John, every new beekeeper wants to know when is the right time to introduce a new queen.
I think someone's trying to ask a question, but I can't hear them.
Is this okay?
Ah, I hear you now.
Every new beekeeper wants to know when the best time to introduce a new queen. From 1 hour to 3 hours to 3 days. But the pheromone situation seems to be the predominant factor.
That is the dominant factor. If you remove a queen, within probably an hour, the bees can detect a drop in that pheromone, but they are still going to be loyal to their queen probably for a little while. I would say you could probably do it within 24 hours, but to be safe, I would still introduce that queen inside of a cage. Don't just drop her in there, regardless, because if they don't know her, they are not likely to accept her. Of course, the longer a hive has been queenless and it's got more laying workers, it gets even harder to requeen.
So John, that brings us to the question that I had. In my own experience, a colony needs to be broodless for about 2 weeks before laying workers become a real issue.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, in general. I mean, it always a little bit of wiggle room, but it seems like about 2 weeks.
And my other question is about drone congregation areas. Do you think that this drone mandibular pheromone is the only pheromone regulating DCAs? I mean, how do they know to get to them? How do they know which ones to go to? They stay in the same place from year to year.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's probably an aspect of geography that we don't really understand, so that this year's drones all die, next year's drones do go to the same places. So it has something to do often with a depression in the land. You know, even though they're above treetops, the tree canopy has a depression in it that allows, I don't know, there's something there that they gather into, and it has to do with the visibility of the sky behind them. there was a couple in Germany that did some great work in the Alps, where they had these great big long valleys where they could set up experiments, and they knew there were no other bees around. But they think that it had a lot to do with just the geography of what's going on. So bees would fly out and they would go down these lines until they encountered certain places. But once the bees are in these certain places, then the pheromones help to keep them kind of circling around and around each other. And it probably helps the queen to be able to locate them as well. And of course, when the queen gets there, then her own pheromones attract the drones to chase her.
I think DCAs are wild.
They are.
I have a question.
Mhm.
I'm a beekeeper, and I noticed that my bees tend to be defensive when I am around the hive. But my wife, who does not go into the hives, is able to garden right next to them without any bother at all. And I'm curious if they can smell me. What do you think?
Well, they most certainly can smell you. I can't smell you, so I can't tell if you smell bad, but the bees may be picking up on different cues, different pheromones that we put off that we're not even aware of. It could be your aftershave or cologne or shampoo or something like that. Are you wearing a bee suit? And is it one that hasn't been washed in a long time? Because there may be odors on the gloves, on the veil, your hat, things like that. So there could be things like that go along with it.
Got it. Makes sense.
Hi, John. I have a question.
Yes.
I have a compost bin kind of close to my hive. And every time I go and turn the compost, the bees attack me. What do you think is causing that?
That's a good question. There could be some odor associated with that, but I don't really know. I'd have to give that one some thought.
Yeah, I've been following some of the, bee blogs, and a lot of people report the same phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. There could be an odor associated with the decay there that is mimicking alarm pheromone. Just like, it smells like bananas to us. Are you throwing a lot of banana peels out? Not that would necessarily be it, but there could be some combination of other things that are upsetting the bees in that particular spot. It might just mean you need to move your compost or
Yeah.
toss things out when the bees aren't very active.
Yeah, it's a bit too late, but yeah, live and learn. Thank you.
Hi, I had a question about stacking too many supers and how that would affect communication and pheromones.
Stacking too many supers should not necessarily affect the pheromones. A lot of the pheromones are spread by contact from bee to bee to bee through trophallaxis. Things like alarm pheromone generally are not going to be such an issue inside the hive unless there is a pest in the hive, like wax moth, something like that the bees are specifically attacking. Those kind of pheromones are going to be released down towards the entrance, and they're going to be present when there's an emergency, and then when that's over, they kind of drift off with the wind. Same with the nasanov pheromone and other things like that. Empty comb itself seems to stimulate bees to go out and forage more and even stimulate brood rearing a little bit. But just the action of having a lot of supers on the hive should not make that much difference in the pheromone environment and the communication within the hive itself.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question for you, John. Queen poop. I found your coverage of this topic interesting and amusing. I've always been under the impression that queen poop smells like roses. Now, is that mature mated queen poop, or is it virgin queen poop?
Well, as always, Landy, you get the prize for the best question. I have never personally investigated the qualities of queen poop in any depth. But the pheromones that I talked about that are associated with the virgin queens are only produced for a very short amount of time, and they are repellent to other bees. So I would imagine that maybe your older, mature, mated queens, she might be smelling like roses, but these young ones may not. That's just a guess. I don't have any data to back that up.
Fair enough. Thank you, John. Do we have any more questions here? Everyone's looking kind of stunned. Justin?
I think that's it, John.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Maybe I'll see some of y'all in a couple of weeks in Kentucky.
Maybe Landy.
Maybe so.
Okay, have a good night.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.